Yali and welcome to today's program, Aspire, a Stronger Future, built on the foundations of our faith. We began our program with a rendition of Ya Ali Madad. This beautiful piece about the calling on the help of Ali represents a deeply ingrained tradition of our faith and practice. Tonight's episode is focused on the launch of the IIS's latest publication, Ismaili Festivals, Stories of Celebration by Dr. Shiraz Kabani. This book is the first in a multi-book series focused on living Ismaili traditions, written specifically for an Ismaili audience, for people just like you and me. Let's turn to Dr. Shanul Jiwa to learn more about the series.
One of the guidance from Maulana Hazar Imam was that we should harness the scholarship that we have now put together and we should synthesize it and make it available to a much broader Jamati readership and present it in ways that is of relevance to them, of interest to them, that engages their questions and concerns. How do they articulate who they are in the world that they live in today as Ismailis, as part of the broader Muslim Ummah, among the societies in which they live, and so that whole lived experience of what it means to be an Ismaili today in the 21st century. And so this series aspires to respond to that guidance from Maulana Hazar Imam, but also of the questions and concerns and issues that the deep Jamati engagement that we've had over several decades has given us an understanding and insight of. And so we are calling it therefore the Living Ismaili Traditions Series. And one of the key interests that we've often had Jamati members express to us is knowing more about each other. The fact that we have several traditions in the Jamaat, the Syrian traditions, the Iranian traditions, the broader Badakhshani traditions, the Hazara traditions, the South Asian, Satpanthi traditions. We've got several. And each of these traditions have their own distinctions and their own unique features, but also a shared commonality in terms of, belief and allegiance to the Imam, etc. And understanding the histories, the cultures, the lived expressions of what it means to be a Syrian Ismaili, with a heritage of 1400 years behind them. That whole telling of the Ismaili story from these different traditions is something that Jamaats are very interested in knowing, both about their own, but also about these other, sister traditions, as it were, within the Jamaat. But we are starting the series with stories. Stories are the stuff of human life. We all love stories. We all tell stories about who we are and why we are who we are and what makes us what we are and all of that. So one of the topics that we think and has been expressed over a period of time from the Jamati readership to us is to know more about our festivals, our celebrations. What do they mean? What do they represent? How do they connect us to the world around us, both within the Ummah and the world at large? So that's one of the first titles that we are working on. We will pick up other aspects, other topics, other facets of the Ismaili experience, broadly speaking. And in that regard, we are also very keen that through this series, we reach out to Jamaats across all traditions and across all cultures. And so the work will get translated into all the major Jamati languages, just as we do with our curriculum materials, for example. We are particularly keen that our youth and young adults find this material engaging, relevant, energizing for their own understandings and perspectives. And to that extent, we will reach out as the series begins to take some shape to creative writers within the Jamaat, to scholars within the Jamaat, to storytellers within the Jamaat, who can also then contribute to this Ismaili narrative that has this very long history and traditions and thought and culture and all that, but also has a very powerful, very meaningful lived experience across so many different parts of the world, especially now with the Jamaats, migrating from one part of the world to another. We are beginning to get new stories, new experiences, new ways of understanding who we are as Ismailis as we settle into different parts of the world today. So that, in a nutshell, is the purpose of the series, is the aspiration of the series, and we hope that the Jamats will find it, that each one of us, as we read this, will see ourselves in this, and will see ourselves represented and in some ways engaged in understanding, developing a deeper understanding of who we are and how we are connected to the world around.
Thank you, Dr. Jiva. We have so much to look forward to. And now, time for the main event. Dr. Kabani has graciously taken the time out of his schedule to tour the United States to help us understand a deeper context of his book. He was able to visit with Jamati members in Austin, Texas, and Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Shiraz Kabani is head of the Department of Community Relations at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. A social scientist by academic training with a doctorate in management, he has served in various senior leadership and executive roles across the Ismaili community institutions, including as Vice President of the Ismaili Council for the United Kingdom and Executive Officer of ITREB USA. Amongst his many academic accomplishments, he is the author of a book from the IIS titled Ismaili Festivals, Stories of Celebration, which is part of the Living Ismaili Traditions Series and is available via ITREB. He has also authored a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Islamic Ritual and Practice on the Ismailis, History, Doctrines, and Ritual Practices, as well as leadership lessons from the life of the prominent pioneer of rural development, Shoaib Sultan Khan, for an edited volume entitled Great Muslim Leaders, Lessons for Education. In his capacity as an OIS for nearly 40 years, Dr. Kabani has engaged extensively with Ismaili audiences across more than 20 countries worldwide. I know what you're thinking. Why do only 2 cities get to interact with the author? But don't worry, we surveyed people from around the country, from all different ages and backgrounds, and before he flew back home, we sat him down to get perspective on our most frequently asked questions. Let's begin with the topic of story time. Where there are humans, there are stories. Tales of where we came from, exciting adventures of where we're going next, all centered around a hero who seems to be larger than life. How do these relate to our festivals and who we are? Let's turn to Dr. Kabani to learn more.
Humans are more like storytelling humans. He uses the word storytelling chimpanzees. I was trying to be a little bit more respectful here. But I also noticed from the introductory chapter in your book that you share some thoughts very similar about the human storyteller. If you wouldn't mind sharing with all of us as to how storytelling has impacted our sense of community, and then how has it played in the narrativization of festivals within our community as well?
I think it is right to say that we are all storytellers. All of us tell stories. Because it is these stories that help us make sense of our lives. It is these stories that allow us to believe that what is happening to us in our lives is not a random series of events, that there is some connection. We tell stories to ourselves. If you think about it, there is a story that is going on in our minds about ourselves, in which we are the main characters. Those people who unfortunately sometimes commit suicide, often they leave notes or something that will say, I had nothing else to live for. What that means is that their story ended. They did not have a continuity in their stories. And so they felt that life was not worth living anymore. And anthropologists tell us that as far back as they can record human history, that humans have always told stories. Even the cave drawings that you find, they tell us that these drawings were done to narrate a story about their own lives, their own existences. And so we have always been storytellers. Now, festivals, as we all know, are often connected to stories. So, take for example the festival of Gadir Khum. The story of Gadir Khum is connected with the festival that we celebrate. Take Laylatul Qadr as an example. Well, there is a story behind Laylatul Qadr that something happened to the Prophet in Mount Hira while he was there. These festivals are a way for us to remember the most important stories that are part of our tradition. Because it is these stories that make us who we are. It is these stories that define part of our identity. And in that way, the fact that festivals are connected to stories, that it is also telling the story of the community. And we need to be able to, one, understand these stories so as to be able to explain to others what it means to be Ismaili. And that's the reason why I thought that this would be a useful book to write, because it will help the Jamaat appreciate at least one perspective on what it means to be an Ismaili.
That was a very interesting take about stories. The star of our stories hold the values that we hold dear. Now, let's hear about how some of our ceremonies are directly related to the values that matter to us. Many traditions celebrate values on big festive occasions, but values are something that we live and put into action on a daily basis. So, how do we connect our daily values and practices with the large gatherings that only take place a few times a year? Let's listen in on what was discussed in Austin and Chicago.
Festivals, all festivals,
Yeah.
and songs like these.
Yeah.
For that matter, even the Kirya that we do in Jamaat Khana, all of them are reflective of our values, they are reflective of our identity. You take the example that when you go to Jamaat Khana, one of the traditions that we have in the South Asian tradition, the Koja tradition, is that we go to Mukhi Sahib and we fold our hands and we say certain words. Why do we do that? Well, it's a tremendous act of taking responsibility. We live in a society which has been called a culture of complaint. Everybody wants to complain about everything and where possible blame somebody else for their problems. But in Jamaat Khana, we are told, no, you take responsibility. So we go to Mukhi Sahib or Mukhi Anima and we say, sorry, I made mistakes. I take responsibility. Look at the value. You see, this is the value we are teaching. And I think that's the important part, is that we celebrate our festivals in a way that reinforces these sorts of values.
You talk about this tradition of saying Bolyo Chale Maaf, right? And the fascinating thing is that we are looking and seeking forgiveness during celebratory festivals. And so my question to you is, what are your thoughts, and if you could share some thoughts around what is it about festivals that allows us to open our hearts to receive as well as to offer compassion to people within the community, within our families, and amongst whom we live?
So, Murad, at the start of your question, you made a very useful point, that no one should see this book as the final word on anything. This is one perspective on how we understand festivals, how we celebrate them, the rituals that go with it, and the practices that go with it. And I have deliberately, in this book, often presented the counter-narrative as well. Because you see, sometimes what happens is that people become too sure of their knowledge. And they're not quite sure where that knowledge is coming from. And so I think it was important that when I was presenting some ways in which Ismailis understand certain ideas, I also presented how other Muslims understand the same ideas, and their views are completely different from ours. But they have their own logic. They have their own understanding. And we should be able to see, so to speak, both sides of the story. Right? Now, as far as certain traditions are concerned, look, The word festival comes from the idea of feast. Feast, where you break bread together, you get together with families and communities. So it is a celebratory event. And generally when it is a celebration, when we are happy, we are much more forgiving. And it is a good time to ask for forgiveness. And so it is not surprising that there is a tradition, not just in our Jamaat, but in many communities. I mean, you will find even in places like Malaysia, for example, that there is a tradition that on Eid al-Fitr, that young boys and girls, they kneel before their parents and they will ask for forgiveness.
Wow.
So it's a very common idea that at times of happiness is the time to turn to your fellow human beings and ask for forgiveness. And these traditions also avoid embarrassment. You see, if you went to somebody at any other time and asked for forgiveness, there is an element of embarrassment that is connected to it. But if you do it as part of a ritual that is taking place at a festival, there is no embarrassment associated with it. And so these are very beautiful traditions. And festivals, like many rituals of the community, are connected with values. And it is those values that get highlighted. And one of those values is being broad-hearted, to be able to forgive people their trespasses, their mistakes, just as much as the humility that one ought to have to be able to ask for forgiveness for the mistakes that we have made. And I think associating festivals with values is a very important part of celebrating these festivals.
Ya Ali Madad. I'm an RAC teacher, and my students usually ask me the same question you pose. Did millions of animals have to be slaughtered to celebrate Eid? Are there more modern or contemporary practices of sacrifice that allow us to celebrate without slaughtering animals?
So look, the first thing that we need to understand is, what do we mean by the word qurbani? Most people, when they use the word qurbani, they are actually referring to the slaughtering of the animal. That's not qurbani. The qurbani has to do with what you do with the meat of the animal that you sacrifice or you slaughter. In Muslim tradition, you can't keep all the meat for yourself, even for your relatives. Most Muslims would say that you can't keep more than a third for yourself, which means that 2/3 of it has to be given away to the poor and the needy. And so the qurbani is the idea of doing something, helping those who are in need. Now, you see, nowadays, there are many organizations, in fact, you probably would get letters from them, who tell you that, look, if you were to contribute a certain amount towards this particular charity, they will use it to help the poor and the needy, and in that way, you will have fulfilled this notion of qurbani that is associated with Eid al-Adha. You don't have to actually physically sacrifice an animal. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who get concerned with the large number of animal sacrifices that happen around Eid al-Adha. But look, unless you are a vegetarian or a vegan, you know that every time you eat a chicken burger or a hamburger, it is because certain animals have been killed to provide that meat for you. So the slaughter of animals should not worry you or should not concern you. Now, of course, if you are a vegetarian or vegan, or you are otherwise concerned about the environment, well, then you do have other ways of fulfilling the objective of that sacrifice. You know, in the Ismaili tradition, particularly the Central Asian tradition, there is a practice known as Chirag, which is a burial practice or post-burial practice. One of the elements of the Chirag is the sacrifice or the slaughter of an animal. And then kind of the meat is cooked and served to the people who participate in that ceremony. Now, in some cases, this might be posing a difficulty for the family because it is expensive sometimes to have an animal and slaughter that animal and serve the meat to everybody. It was Maulana Hazar Imam's direction and guidance to the community to say that, well, if you are finding that difficult to do, then you have alternatives. And the alternatives that Maulana Hazar Imam recommended was that some members of the family may wish to fast for a certain number of days. Another alternative that Maulana Hazar Imam recommended was that certain members of the family may wish to offer a certain number of days or hours of services to the Jamaat and others. And in that way, this element of Qurbani that was part of the Chirag Roshan practice could be fulfilled. And so one could broaden that definition and use these sorts of methods that Maulana Hazar Imam has recommended to fulfill our obligation of Qurbani even for Eid al-Adha.
Thank you, Dr. Kabani, for putting it so succinctly. Our festivals and ceremonies are anchored to the values we cherish as a community. For example, the value of forgiveness and accountability are the foundation of many of our festivals, like Laylatul Qadr or Eid. But additionally, we also engage with these values every time we go to Jamaat Khana with our ritual of Dua Karabi. Isn't that such a blessing? To dig deeper, part of our practice of accepting responsibility requires us to contemplate our own ego. Ego is like the me of our minds, but when we take account of our deeds, our vision shifts to one of humility, where we see and feel something larger than ourselves, and our ego is put on hold. In the next clip from Chicago, Dr. Kabani offers a Sufi perspective on the Quran and the life of the Prophet, reflection and elevation of our own spirit.
Asking the question on Miraj, where you quote Muhammad Iqbal, referring to Miraj as an example of what he called perfect manhood, where the human ego reaches its zenith and is able to retain full self-possession. You followed this statement with another insight from Muhammad Iqbal as well, quoting, "Through spiritual quest, we become part of the ultimate essence without losing our unique spiritual identity." I'm still wrapping my head around this idea of these two statements and would love your help in thinking it through within the context of Miraj as well as our spiritual practices.
You know, one of the things that I say in the book is that, it's a quote from somebody, I don't know who said this, is that reading helps you define the contours of your ignorance. The more you read, you learn all the things that you don't know, and how much more there is that you don't know, right? And that's why it is really, really good to read as much as you can, but read very selectively, you know, because we have only very limited time to read. Now, with regard to your specific question, you see, amongst the esoteric communities of Islam, there are the Sufis. And Sufis believe in spiritual, you know, or spiritual progress, or the effort for spiritual enlightenment. And in this path to spiritual growth, they have what they call makamat. One of the makam stations, right? Makamat stations. One of the makams in Sufism is that of fana. You will hear this in Imam Sultan Shah's Farmans as well. He talks about fana fillah, right? This is Sufi vocabulary. So the idea of fana is to say that through practice, one learns to subdue one's own ego to the point where you reach a point of complete non-existence before God. That you have no desires, no expectations, no priorities, no preferences, except that which God wishes you to do. So in everything that you do, your question is not what I want to do, but what would God have me do. The extreme of this is what Sufis would call fanafil, that one has subdued one's ego to a point where you don't exist anymore, your desires don't exist anymore. But that's only the first stage of spiritual enlightenment. There is a next stage in Sufism which they call bakabil. That once you have annihilated your own ego, you come back to live in the reflection of God. That you live in accordance with the wishes of God. Now, this is all very complicated, right? Many of you must have heard this analogy, the cave analogy of Plato. Plato, the Greek philosopher. And I'll tell you this analogy very quickly. What he says is that, think about some young men being captured when they were very young, and they were taken into a cave, and they were tied up in such a way that they could only look in front of them in the cave, and all they could see was the wall of the cave. Behind them there is a fire burning, and there is a bridge. So as people or horse carts or something that are passing by, their reflection is falling on the wall of the cave. These boys that were captured, they look at that, and to them, this is the only reality that they know. And so Plato says that to them, this is the only reality. But he says, suppose one day somebody comes and takes off the shackles of one of them and gets him to turn around to look at the fire, to say, that's not reality. Let me show you what is reality. He says first, he won't be able to see anything. His eyes will get dazzled. But then he will realize that, there is something else that is real. And then he said that suppose you drag this person out of the cave and let him see sunlight. Then, in the light of the sun, the reality that appears to him, Plato says that that's when he realizes that I was wasting my time in the cave. That what I thought was reality is not real at all. And that true reality is so far away from what I think is reality. But now you bring that person back into the cave so that he can help the rest of them understand that, this is not reality, the reality is outside. The idea of the, he talks about Khudi Iqbal and the Mard Momen. That his idea was that the person who is Baka Billah is like that man coming back into the cave after having realized the reality. And so I think that's what I was trying to explain in the book, is that the notion of the perfect manhood of the prophet, because that's the prophetic role, right? That you understand reality and you come back to humanity to say, well, let me show you what is the true reality.
There's a quote from Rumi where he says that the prophet is not just the cupbearer serving divine wisdom. He's the vessel through which this wisdom is offered to mankind. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and how we think of the prophet in the Muslim world today?
Well, look, the one who serves the wine has nothing to do with the quality of the wine. The quality of the wine is independent of the one who is serving it. But that is not true of the containers. Now, you see, I'm not a wine drinker, but if you study it carefully, you would know that the container of the wine plays a very significant role in the quality of the wine. So, for example, the level of oxidation of the wine, or the light strike. You must have seen that most wines are served in dark bottles. There is a reason for that. Or the level of contamination of the wine. All of that has to do with the container. And so Rumi seems to have known this. And so what Rumi was trying to say is that the Prophet was not just a postman who received a message and delivered the message, but that his life and his personality shaped the Quran. That he had an influence, his life had an influence in how the Quran was communicated to the people. Which is why you know that in the Quran we are told that the prophet's life is a model for us to emulate. Because his life was a manifestation of the teachings of the Quran. And in that way, in very few words, Rumi is trying to communicate the role of the Prophet as being far more than just a postman who received and delivered a message. You know, this is the beauty of poetry, that you can use very few words, but to communicate a very big idea. And I think this is a very big idea that Rumi tries to communicate through his verse.
We often like to think of our worldly journey as a train ride with different stations. But I would say our spiritual journey is like an airplane ride, where we take off and seek elevation, absorb the new perspectives from high above, and as Dr. Kabani mentioned, we return with a deeper purpose as we proceed to our next gate. Stories of celebration includes many different viewpoints, but it is intended about Ismaili perspectives for our own personal growth. So where do we, as Ismaili Muslims, fit into the picture? Where can Ismailis find strength? In addition to the Prophet, one of those sources is Hazrat Ali. Let's visit Chicago to dive into it with a common question that helps us understand Imam Ali the hero and Imam Ali, who is always with us time and time again.
I often struggle reconciling between the role of Imam Ali as someone we ask for help in our prayers and that of the physical Imam Ali, who himself faced so many difficulties throughout his life. What advice would you have for me, whose rational intellect is having trouble negotiating between the two?
Yes. You see, in matters of faith, things often make sense only if you accept the idea of a spiritual world. If you don't accept the idea of a spirit and the spiritual world where it comes from and returns to, well, then a lot of things don't make sense. Amongst Muslims, and of course this is true of Ismailis as well, we believe that something about us survives after our physical death. You know, tonight in Jamati there was an announcement of certain people passing away. But look at how it was announced. That so-and-so, their ruhani has reached the presence of Mawla, right? Look, the announcement is the announcement of arrival, not departure. What does that say? It says about this very idea that there is something of us that survives and arrives somewhere, you see? And so, yes, Hazrat Ali is not physically present with us, but that doesn't mean that he is spiritually gone. That just like our spirits survive, the spirit of Hazrat Ali survives. And this is true not just for us, this is true for all Muslims. I mean, look, to this day, Ismailis do and other Muslims do, they often turn to the Prophet for succor, for help, for hope. I am reminded of this beautiful Qawwali of Purnam Allahabadi. Kash Purnam Dayare Nabi mein jeete ji ho bulawa kisi din. Hale gham Mustafa ko sunao, tham kar unke roze ki jali. Well, look at the beauty of the words, right? Purnam Allahabadi, he says that I wish that I have an opportunity to go to Medina, where the Prophet is buried. That I would go there, I would hold the grill that is around his grave, and I would tell him all the sorrows of my life. Right? Because the Prophet is physically dead, but he's spiritually not dead. And so Ali is physically not here, but spiritually he is still here. And so the believer, the Shia of Ali, believe that when our spirit calls out, the spirit of Ali hears and responds. For the Ismailis, this is even more than that. For the Ismailis, the Imam of the time is the Ali of his time. You remember this Gilan that we often sing, Heavy Ali, Nehoish Ali, right? That today the Imam who is there is Ali, and the future Imam will also be Ali. So for us, Ali is still there, even physically present. And that's why, as Ismailis, we believe that when we stand in Jamaat Khana and we say, Ya Ali Hazar Iman to Asanji Kul Mushkil Nu Asan Kariye, if it comes from the heart, if it comes from the spirit, Ismailis believe that the Imam's spirit hears and responds. Right? That's how we reconcile it. That yes, the Imam is not physically here, but the spiritual world is not limited by time and space. And so a call in this Jamaat Khana to reach, Imam Sultan used to say this, that when a murid calls out, that connection goes faster than the trunk call. In those days, they used to have to make trunk calls, right? He says that it gets there faster than a trunk call. Right? That's the idea.
We call upon the eternal, spiritual Ali, who is always with us from our daily greetings to our festive tasbeehs. On the other hand, Hazrat Ali is also known as the Mushkil Kusha. How does his title of Mushkil Kusha, the remover of difficulties, give us hope to address the difficulties that we face? Let's tune into Austin to find out more.
They said, La fata illa Ali, la saif illa zulfikar. And how do we know this? That in later life, Hazrat Ali said that when I was with the Prophet defending him, it was the Prophet who told me that, can you hear those voices? That look, the angels are praising you. See, that's how it is recorded in the tradition. And so Hazrat Ali is seen as Mushkil Kusha, not just by the Shia.
Yes.
Ali is seen as Mushkil Kusha by the vast majority of Muslims.
Right.
He's referred to as Mushkil Kusha, the person who alleviates your difficulties. And of course, in our Jamaat and amongst the Shia, this idea has become so important, so emblematic of being a Shia, that when we greet each other, we say, Ya Ali Madad. You see? And by the way, Ya Ali Madad is not just for the Ismailis. If you meet an Isnashri outside, you can say Ya Ali Madad to them, they will say Mawla Ali Madad. Because this is a Shia greeting. And this goes back, 13th, 14th, 15th century onwards, that we see that the Shia use this Ya Ali Madad as a greeting amongst them. Yeah. This is how important the role of Mushkil Kusha of Hazrat Ali, but for us, Maulana Hazar Imam, has become for the Shia in general.
How does that resonate, in your opinion, in today's world where sometimes, our struggles may seem a little less severe than ones faced in the past by ancestors or people, maybe not even just today, but in other parts of the world maybe that are facing. And when our kids come and we teach them Nade Ali, right? And that is one of the first prayers, we've taught our kids. And it feels like sometimes the kids of today, not just youth, but I think generally, we are very privileged to live in a space where we're not that often surrounded by really major life challenges. So how does that kind of resonate to a world where we live in a lot of maybe privilege, but we have our own set of troubles? How do we think of this notion of Mushkil Kusha for us today?
Yeah. I have never met a person who says that I have no trouble.
Yeah, right. right.
Everybody has some challenges in life.
Yes.
Imam Sultan Moshe used to say that life is full of challenges, and life cannot be without challenges. Yeah. So I think it is important that we teach the young of our Jamaat particularly that, religion is a source of hope. Mm-hmm. In Urdu we say ummeed, right? It comes from faith. Because when nothing works, in Urdu there is a phrase, when somebody is very sick, some illness that you can't cure, the doctor will say, कि इनको अब दवा की नहीं, दुआ की ज़रूरत है. Because when nothing on this earth will work, there is a power that is greater than anything else. Mm-hmm. And so they say that, look, that's where hope comes from, you see. And so this idea of the Nade Ali seeking help, that it is a source of hope. I think one of the things that has happened to us in contemporary times mostly is that we think of prayers like magic. You see, we think that, you see, something has gone wrong, I'll go to Jamaat Khana, I'll put some money down and, I will make an offering and make a prayer and, like magic, things will change. Now, look, for some people that happens, okay? But that's only one way of looking at prayer. There's only one way of looking at the idea of mushkil kushai, right? The other is this idea of hope. Hazrat Ali had a very beautiful saying about this. Hazrat Ali used to say that when you say prayer, one of four things can happen. One is that your prayer will be accepted. God will grant you what you've asked for. If God doesn't grant you what you have asked for, because God thinks it is not the right thing for you. Sometimes we ask for things that we shouldn't ask for. Sometimes people even ask for bad things. Bad things to happen to other people. Now, if God doesn't think that that is the right thing for you to happen, that God grants you something else instead, because you have asked Him. You see? So He doesn't grant you what you have asked for, He might grant you something else. If God doesn't even do that, then God might forgive your sins, some of your mistakes as a result, just because you've asked for prayer. And if God doesn't even do that, He will hold it in your account. So that on the day of judgment,
He will grant you something.
You got credit.
You get credit.
So Hazrat Ali used to say, don't worry about whether your prayers get accepted or not.
Right.
Ask. Say your prayers. And so I think we should understand mushkil kushai from that point of view as well.
Yeah.
We ask for mushkil kushai. We ask for Mawla's help. Sometimes it will come. Sometimes it will come in the form of what the Quran calls sakina. Sakina is a kind of peace that descends on you. And this is a peace that comes from God. That even though you are so worried, even though life has so many difficulties, there is a peace that comes to you from God, and you suddenly don't feel worried. The mushkil is still there, but you don't feel worried anymore. So that's another way to think about mushkil kusha. So Nadia Ali, I think when we teach it, I hope we teach it in this way.
Isn't that just simply amazing? All the references to Hazrat Ali, Ya Ali Madad, our daily dhikr, the festive tasbeehs we recite communally and personally. Our call to Ali goes beyond mushkil kusha and removing difficulties. It is about finding strength and replacing what feels like weakness with hope for a better future. The next time you hear Ya Ali Madad, close your eyes and try to feel the strength come to you. And sometimes the best way to feel something is through music. Our next clip is a musical performance of Bhardo Joli, where a devotee is approaching Prophet Muhammad with outstretched arms and a joli as a symbol of collecting strength, help, and mercy to alleviate their difficulties. My brothers and sisters, I present Doom live in Chicago.
Bhardo Joli, Bhardo Joli, Bhardo Joli मेरी या मुहम्मद लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली Bhardo Joli मेरी या मुहम्मद लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली हाँ Bhardo Joli मेरी या मुहम्मद लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली Bhardo Joli मेरी या मुहम्मद लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली खोजते खोजते तुझको देखो क्या से खोजते खोजते तुझको देखो क्या से क्या या नबी हो गया हूँ बेखबर दर बदर फिर रहा हूँ मैं यहाँ से वहाँ हो गया हूँ बेखबर दर बदर फिर रहा हूँ मैं यहाँ से वहाँ हो गया हूँ दे दे या नबी मेरे दिल को दिलासा आया हूँ दूर से मैं होके रुहासा दे दे या नबी मेरे दिल को दिलासा आया हूँ दूर से मैं होके रुहासा कर दे करम नबी मुझ पे भी जरा सा जब तलक तू पना दे न बिगड़ी दर से तेरे न जाए सवाली भर दो झोली मेरी या मोहम्मद लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली भर दो झोली आका जी भर दो झोली हम सब की भर दो झोली नबी जी भर दो झोली मेरे सरकार मदीना लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली ओ भर दो झोली मेरी या मोहम्मद लौट कर मैं न जाऊंगा खाली
So far, we've traversed over our entire history. We've talked about our human history in the form of stories. We've talked about prophethood and about how the hero of Hazrat Ali is still with us today. But what about the future? How do we take these celebrations, these values, and our identity with us tomorrow, next year, or the next generation? And you guessed it, Dr. Kabani shares his perspective with Jamati members in Austin and around the country.
But there's a quote in the book that I want to, if it's okay, recite out. Yes. And I think what it does nicely is it talks about the power of new beginnings. And I would love to read it to you all and then ask a follow-up question. So this is actually a quote that is, or a hadith that is attributed to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, alayhi salam. And it's quoted from the book, the Bihar al-Anwar. And in it, they quote Imam Jafar al-Sadiq as having said this. And it says, "The day of Nowruz is the day God accepted the covenants of his servants to worship him. It is the first day upon which the sun rose and the winds blew, and the splendor of the world was created. It is the day Noah's ark grounded upon Mount Ararat. It is the day on which Gabriel came down to the messenger of God. It is the day on which the prophet ordered his companions to pledge allegiance to Ali as commander of the faithful. No Nowruz comes unless we expect release from suffering, for this day is an attribute of ours and our Shi'ais." So it's such a powerful, a quote, yes. Of course, attributed to the Imam. And what I love about it is that it talks about these very real historical events, but it's linking them to a day of Nowruz, which perhaps isn't always March 21st in this context. Yes. But I would love for you to articulate that a bit as to what this might mean in terms of the significance of these events being attributed to having happened on Nowruz.
In fact, just a few days ago, somebody sent me that question. Yeah. Because, our young people are very smart. Yeah. And so somebody actually did the calculations. Yes. Because you can do this calculation online, right? Yeah. As to what was the date when Ghadir Khum actually happened.
Right, exactly.
If that was the day. Yeah. And, this person wrote to me to say, well, I've done the calculation. It wasn't 21st of March. So how can you say that this is what Imam Jafar al-Sadiq says? Well, look, as you correctly point out, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq is using this term Nowruz in its symbolic sense. I mean, he talks about the fact that when the world was created, it was Nowruz.
Yeah.
Now, you see, that would make no sense,
Right.
physically speaking, because you see, the calendar has to do with the creation, the sun is there, and the earth goes around the sun, and that's how you get years and months and so on. Well, there was no such thing before the world was created. So clearly, he's not talking about 21st of March. He's talking about the idea of rebirth. He's talking about the idea of beginnings, right? And so as Shias, because all Shias recognize this hadith, how would we look at it? Well, perhaps we could say that the Imam is also asserting, as part of what he is saying, he's asserting his authority as the one who provides spiritual rejuvenation, right? There was a farman of Hazrat Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah. People used to ask him about miracles.
Yeah.
And, have you made can you do miracles and things like that? And the Imam said that, look, every madari can do miracles.
Yes,
You see? Any street magician can do miracles, he says. He said, I'm not a madari, I'm not a magician. But he says, what my magic is to take you from here and get you to salvation.
Yes.
You see, he said, that's my magic. And I think that's what Imam Jafar Sadiq is trying to say. That as the Imam, he says that because that is the day when Ali was declared as the Imam, and he himself is asserting this as one who provides that kind of spiritual rejuvenation. I mean, another way to look at it is that, see, part of the role of the Imam is to contextualize faith.
Yeah.
You see, one of the greatest problems of the Muslim world today is that many Muslims take the words of the Quran and the words of the Prophet as they have come down to us out of context, right? And then they try to apply it in modern life. And sometimes that makes no sense. I tell one of the stories in this book about this author, Ziauddin Sardar. Ziauddin Sardar went to Pakistan. He's originally from Pakistan, but he lives in Britain. He went to Pakistan to a madrasa, and he was waiting to meet the principal of the madrasa. And while he is waiting, a young student of the madrasa, with his beard and short shalwar, he came to Ziauddin and he says, "Are you a Muslim?" And Ziauddin says, "Yes, I am a Muslim." He says, "But you are not a good Muslim, are you?" So Ziauddin says that, "What do you mean?" He says, I try to be a good Muslim. Yeah. But he says, "Why are you asking me? Why are you asking me that I'm not a good Muslim?" He says, "Well, but because you don't have a beard." So Ziauddin says that, "Well, why should I have a beard?" He said, "Well, it is the sunnah of the Prophet. The Prophet had a beard." So Ziauddin told him that if Prophet had a blade, he would have probably used it. Now, this is a funny story. But what does that tell you?
Yeah.
What it tells you is that you are reading the life of the Prophet out of context.
Yeah.
And you are kind of making things difficult for yourself. Yeah. And that is the role of the Imam of the time, of Hazar Imam, that he contextualizes this guidance of the Quran, guidance of the Prophet for our times.
Yes.
And I think by talking about Nowruz as a new beginning, as rejuvenation, he's also claiming this right of the Imam to be the one who gives new life to religion by contextualizing it. So that's how I understand this particular hadith.
That is so powerful.
જ્યારે અમે નાના હતા અમને અમારા માવતરો કહેતા હતા કે ઇમામ બોલતો કુરાન છે અને કેટલે એની ઠેકાણે એવું કહેવામાં આવે છે કે કુરાન બોલતો નથી તે કારણે એની અર્થઘટન કરવા માટે ઇમામની જરૂરત પડે છે. તો મારો સવાલ છે કે હજી આપણને કુરાન વાંચવાની જરૂરત છે?
તમે વિચાર કરો કે તમારી પાસે ફિઝિક્સની ચોપડી હોય કે કેમિસ્ટ્રીની કોઈ પુસ્તક હોય તો એ પણ બોલતી નથી. અને જો તમને કેમિસ્ટ્રી સ્ટડી કરવી હોય કે ફિઝિક્સ સ્ટડી કરવી હોય તો તમને એક શિક્ષકની જરૂર પડે છે. અને જો તમારી પાસે એક સારો શિક્ષક હોય કે જે તમને જ્ઞાન આપે, કંઈ પણ હોય, ફિઝિક્સનો હોય કે કેમિસ્ટ્રીનો હોય કે ધર્મનો હોય, જો તમારી પાસે શિક્ષક હોય તો ચોપડીઓ જે છે, પુસ્તકો જે છે તે નકામી નથી થઈ જતી. તમને પુસ્તકની પણ જરૂર છે અને શિક્ષકની પણ જરૂર છે. આ શિક્ષક અને પુસ્તકનો જે સંયોજન છે, કોમ્બિનેશન છે, એના દ્વારા આપણને ધર્મની કે કોઈ પણ તાલીમ મળે છે, શિક્ષા મળે છે. કુરાનને સમજવું અઘરું છે, થોડીક મુશ્કેલ થાય છે, તકલીફ થાય છે લોકોને. જે લોકો પાસે બરાબર ધર્મનો કે કુરાનનો, નબી સાહેબની હયાતનો, જિંદગીનો ઇલ્મ નથી, નોલેજ નથી, તે લોકો કુરાનને બરાબર રીતે, સરખી રીતે સમજી નથી શકતા. એટલે જો તમારી પાસે આવું નોલેજ ન હોય તો તમે કુરાનને બરાબર રીતે, સરખી રીતે વાંચી નહીં શકો. જોકે આપણી ધાર્મિક ક્રિયાઓમાં, આપણી દુઆમાં, આપણી ઝિયારતમાં અને બીજી ક્રિયાઓમાં કુરાનના ઘણા બધા ભાગો છે કે જેનો આપણે પઠન કરીએ છીએ. એટલે કે આપણી રોજિંદી ધાર્મિક ક્રિયાઓમાં કુરાનનો ભાગ છે. પણ જો તમને કુરાનને વાંચવું હોય તો તમને પહેલે એ સમજવાનું છે કે એ કુરાન કઈ જાતની ચોપડી છે, કઈ જાતની પુસ્તક છે. ને એ અઘરું છે, ઘણા બધા લોકો માટે ડિફિકલ્ટ છે. આપણા ઇમામે આપણને હિદાયત આપી છે કે કુરાનના ખાસ એવા ભાગો છે કે જેના અંદર આપણા તરીકા માટે એક વિશેષ અર્થ છે. અને જો આવા ભાગો જે છે કે જેના અંદર ખાસ આપણા તરીકા માટે ખાસ અર્થ છે, વિશેષ અર્થ છે, એ ભાગો ચોક્કસ રીતે આપણને વાંચવા જોઈએ અને જેટલું બની શકે આપણને સમજવા જોઈએ. what does it mean to be an Ismaili? The general answer that I will get is that, well, it means that you believe in Hazrat Imam. And I think it is much more than that. Being an Ismaili is not about having some kind of philosophical idea in your mind. You see, believing, look at the word, believing in Hazrat Imam. This is just a philosophy in our mind. That's not Ismailism. To be an Ismaili means to think in a particular way.
Yeah.
To be an Ismaili means to behave in a particular way. What is that? How many of us can speak about these things? And I think this is what we need to do, because that's the only way that our future generations will understand what it means to be an Ismaili, what it means to be a Muslim, and be able to articulate proudly that you see, nowadays a lot of university students will not even identify themselves as Muslims.
Yeah.
You see, some people think that they are Indians and they must be Hindus. And, many Muslims will kind of leave it at that. To say,
That's not correct then.
Yes. That shouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
You see? We should be proud of who we are. We should be able to speak about who we are very clearly. But for that, we have to do some work.
Yeah.
We have to encourage the young, for example, to make new songs.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really pleased that Ismaili TV is presenting so many new devotional songs written by the young of our community in all the languages of the Jamaat, right?
Yeah.
That's what we have to do. We have to encourage the young to express their devotion in their own way, in their own language. And we at home and in Jamaat Khana, we have to find ways to transfer the tradition, the values, the identity from one generation to the next generation. That will require creativity, but that will also, more importantly, require flexibility on our part.
We often hear the terms pluralism and diversity and have become sort of buzzwords in our conversations, but I sometimes feel to a very superficial extent. And so I would like to ask tonight for maybe an in-depth conversation around the idea of diversity. After reading and rereading your book cover to cover 3 times in the last couple of months, I realized that every single chapter in your book makes a really powerful statement. It is a powerful statement on diversity as not something that we simply cherish, but we embrace wholeheartedly and celebrate. And so a profound insight that you shared in that chapter is that we, the storytelling humans, see everything from where we stand. And that is the reason there is a diversity of views amongst Muslims on just about everything. Can you share your thoughts as to why this dance of unity and diversity, as you call it, is worthy of our celebration?
Yes.
So the point that you made about the fact that we see things the way we are, where we are standing. I tell an interesting story about Mullah Nasruddin in the book. Mullah Nasruddin, most of you would have heard of, is the wise fool of Muslim folklore. And so Mullah is sitting at the bank of a river fishing. From the opposite bank, somebody calls out and asks him, Mullah, where is the nearest bridge to get on the other side? So Mullah looks at him quizzically, scratches his head and says, you don't need a bridge, you are already on the other side. Funny as that might sound, if Mullah had a point. From his point of view, that fellow was already on the other side. And I think that's the point that I try to make, is that we see things from where we are standing. And each one of us has a different intellectual profile. Each one of us has a different spiritual profile. We are not just products of our DNA and chromosomes. We are also products of our past. I mean, look, if you read this book, one of the inescapable conclusions of this book would be that this has been written by a South Asian of Pakistani origin. You see, because I'm a product of that past. We are all like that. Right? We are all products of our past, our education, our upbringing, the environment in which we lived, and so on. And so, any community that does not recognize that diversity that exists, does not respect that diversity, will find itself scattered. Because recognizing the differences amongst us requires that we allow for flexibility. That we don't expect that everybody is going to do everything exactly the same way. Right? I'll give you an example. If you see in Jamaat Khana people performing their prayers, when the time comes, for example, to raise hands in prayer, well, people do it very differently, right? People will hold their hands like this, or many other ways. I actually remember, you see, when I was in Pakistan and I used to go to what used to be called night school, my teacher did not understand this idea of flexibility. And so he would insist that I would hold my hands like this. And even as a child, I was an argumentative child. And so I used to argue with the teacher to say, but my dad holds his hands like this. So why are you asking me to hold it like this? He said, well, you are asking for something. And if you hold your hand like this, even as a child, I knew that wasn't a good experience. And I think that's the point I was making earlier, that we have to work out amongst ourselves, leaders, educators, and the Jamaat. Where is it that we want people to do things exactly the same way? And where is it that we want to allow for flexibility and allow people to understand things in their own way, do things in their own way? That's the dance I'm talking about. Right? That there is a certain degree of unity and there is a certain degree of diversity within the community. And if you don't do that dance well, then everybody's going to fall down. Right? Communities do not survive when flexibility and taking account of the diversity is not done effectively within a community. And I think as a community, we have the great good fortune of the wisdom of the Imam that is available to us, who clearly recognizes this, who clearly sees the diversity and clearly encourages the role of the intellect. You see, if you ask people to apply their own intellects, people will come to different conclusions. People will come to different understandings. And so by the Imam encouraging us to use our intellects even in matters of faith, he's telling us that you have agency, you have the ability, and you might come to a different conclusion, and that is okay for the Imam. He's allowing for that flexibility. Now, you see, sometimes what happens is that the community finds that flexibility also problematic. When I travel across the world, one of the questions that I often get asked is that, look, we are one Jamaat. Why don't we do everything exactly the same way? Because the view is, and this is kind of a imposed view, we are so used to living in contexts, particularly in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran, where there is conformity that is demanded. And so there is a certain view that is held even in our Jamaat, that conformity, absolute conformity, is the right thing to do. But we forget that when you try to say that, look, we will do all of our rituals in this way, which ritual are you going to pick? The way you do it in Pakistan? The way you do it in India? Because even Pakistan and India don't do things exactly the same. Or will you do it the way Canadians do it, or will you do it the way East Africans do it, or Afghans do it? I mean, which one are you going to select? You can see the problem with this. And the Imam has deliberately chosen not to do that. to have that kind of conformity. And I think that that's the dance of unity and diversity that in fact, the entire book is about that, is to understand this, that we must recognize the diversity of the Muslim world. We must also recognize the diversity of the Ismaili Jamaat. You know, sometimes amongst our Jamaat, I find that people think that all Muslims do one thing, and then there are these Ismailis who do their own thing. It's not the case. Which is why in the book, when I refer to, and I have discussed Ismaili rituals in the book, I've talked about Jura and Majalis and Betul Khayal and other such things. And I have used vocabulary that is common amongst other Muslim traditions. That what we do in our Jamaat Khanas is perfectly part of that rich diversity that exists in the Muslim world. So we don't have to feel like we are oddballs in the Muslim world. We are certainly not. Our practices often mirror the practices of many other communities. But we have to understand that, and we have to appreciate that, and we have to appreciate the diversity of our Jamaat. And when you see difference, instead of being concerned, perhaps you should smile about it. You say, how wonderful that we have an Imam that allows this kind of recognition of our diversity and allows the freedom for us to be able to understand and practice our faith in our times according to our circumstances. That's a great strength that we have, and I hope that this book brings out some of that.
What a journey! On behalf of ITREB USA, I would like to extend our immense gratitude to Dr. Kabani for taking the time to share his thoughts between the lines of his new book. We hope that as we read Ismaili Festivals, Stories of Celebration, we strengthen our connections, our values, our community, and the daily practice of our faith. The full-length recordings of both the Austin and Chicago book launch will be available for your viewing soon. Please look out for them on the Ismaili USA website. But before we depart, we have one last treat for you. Shahi Medina, performed by the Dhun Band from Chicago.
Shahi Medina.